These are some excerpts from Derrick Jensen's Dreams that, I would recommend the whole book, but these are some things that jumped out at me when I read it. Most of us have read at least a little about the Aztec practice mentioned of sacrificing humans to their gods. Some of the accounts are mind-boggling in their scale. One account, for example, of the rituals surrounding the reconsecration of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan in 1487 suggests that 80,400 prisoners were killed in 4 days. These numbers are probably exaggerated. The priest would have had to kill 14 people per minute the entire time. In contrast, at Auschwitz, the Nazis were able, with modern technology, to kill only, at most, 19,200 people per day. Most estimates these days run from an extreme low of suggesting the Aztecs sacrificed 300 people per year to a realistic high-end estimate of 20,000 people per year, although some still suggest that number may be as high as 250,000 people per year. No matter the numbers, it's clear that human sacrifice played an important role in Aztec society, with sacrifices for different festivals, sacrifices to different gods, and so on. The sacrificial victims were often enemy warriors, but each god required a different kind of victim, killed in a different way. The goddess of corn and replenishment required young women to be beheaded and flayed. The god of rain required children, further, required their tears. Children would be forced to cry before their hearts were pulled out. The god of fire required the captives' hearts be pulled out and their bodies burned. The god of war, patron of Tenochtitlan, required the Nahuatl-speaking prisoners whose still beating hearts would be torn from their bodies. The god of night, sorcery, and destiny, the most powerful god, known as the enemy, or the enemy of both sides, who would foment wars in order to provide food and drink for the gods, required a Nahuatl-speaking volunteer, as well as captives who were killed in ritual gladiatorial combat. Not only humans were sacrificed. The Aztecs bred dogs, eagles, jaguars, and deer specifically to sacrifice them. They also sacrificed vast numbers of quail, hummingbirds, rabbits, butterflies, and other insects, and vast amounts of beans, grains, flowers, feathers, paper, rubber, and so on. They also cut themselves to offer their own blood to the gods. Their stated reasoning was, life is because of the gods. With their sacrifice they gave us life. They produce our sustenance, which nourishes life. Central to the Aztec way of life was a belief that the universe required tremendous ongoing sacrifice in order to be sustained. All matter is Tanaquotl, or bodily sacrificial presence of the gods on earth. Everything springs from the blood, or the severed or buried heads, bodies, or fingers of sacrificed gods. Therefore, we owe our lives to these gods, and need to nourish them in return with our own blood. When people today mention human sacrifices performed by Aztecs and others, for human sacrifice has been practiced in many, though certainly not all, cultures, it is commonly discussed merely in terms of the bloodthirstiness and backwardness of these people, as contrasted by the rationality and humanity of this culture and its members. Sam Harris once again continues to articulate many of the central beliefs of the mythology and bigotry of the scientific perspective, and also the commonly held belief that this culture is made up of what was once gods but is now science's chosen people, in response to psychologist Jonathan Haidt, suggesting that, quote, every long-standing ideology and way of life contains some wisdom, some insights into ways of suppressing selfishness, enhancing cooperation, and ultimately enhancing human flourishing, end quote. Harris stated, and my analysis of his comments is in the endnotes, anyone feeling nostalgic for the wisdom of the Aztecs, rest assured there is nothing like this superstitious murder of innocent men, women, and children to suppress selfishness and convey a shared sense of purpose. course, the Aztecs weren't the only culture to have discovered human flourishing at its most sanguinary and psychotic. The Sumerians, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Hebrews, Canaanites, Maya, Inca, Olmecs, Greeks, Romans, Carthaginians, Teutons, Celts, Druids, Vikings, Gauls, Hindus, Thais, Chinese, Japanese, Scandinavians, Maoris, Melanesians, Tahitians, Hawaiians, Balinese, Australian Aborigines, Iraqi, Iroquois, Huron, Cherokee, and numerous other societies ritually murdered their fellow human beings because they believed that invisible gods and goddesses, having an appetite for human flesh, could be so propitiated. Many of their victims were of the same opinion, in fact, and went willingly to slaughter, fully convinced that their deaths would transform the weather, or cure the king of his venereal disease, or in some other way spare their fellows the wrath of the unseen. But what if the Aztecs were in some sense right? What if these gods, or whatever you want to call these other beings, exist? And what if they need to be fed or somehow served? What if, and let's go with this for a moment, try to keep an open mind, just as we did with the ideas that scientists or Christians are right, the Aztecs are actually tapping into some power, or feeding some beings, who then gave the Aztecs something in return, or the Aztecs were aligning themselves with someone or something who fed off these still beating hearts, just as the Aztecs believed. If the Aztecs are to be believed, they killed humans and non-humans in order to feed gods. Years ago, I talked to the Mayan shaman Martin Prechel about how he perceives offerings to other sides, such as those described above. I began by asking him what a shaman is. He said, "Shamans are sometimes considered healers or doctors, but they are really people who deal with tears and holes we create in the net of life. The damage that we all cause in our search for survival. In a sense, all of us, even the most untechnological, spiritual, and benign peoples, are constantly wrecking the world. The question is, how do we respond to that destruction? If we respond as we do in modern culture by ignoring the spiritual debt we create just by living, then the debt will come back to bite us hard. But there are other ways to respond. One is to try to repay that debt by giving gifts of beauty and praise to the sacred, to the invisible world that gives us life. Shamans deal with the problems that arise when we forget the relationships that exist between us and the other world that feeds us, or when, for whatever reason, we don't feed that other world in return. Instead of other world, I would say other sides." He continued, "All of this may sound strange to modern industrialized people, but for the majority of human history, shamans have simply been a part of ordinary life. They exist all over the world. It seems strange to Westerners now because they have systematically devalued the other world and no longer deal with it as part of their everyday lives." End quote. We talked of other things, and later he said, "In the Mayan worldview, we are all born owing a spiritual debt to the other world for having created us, for having sung us into existence. It must be fed, otherwise it's going to take its payment out of our lives." I asked him how one repays this debt. He answered, "You have to give a gift to that which gives you life. It is an actual payment in kind. That is the spiritual economy of a village. It's like my old teacher used to say, you sit singing on a little rock in the middle of a pond, and your song makes a ripple that goes out to the shores where the spirits live. When it hits the shore, it sends an echo back toward you. That echo is the spiritual nutrition. When you send out a gift, you send it out in all directions at once, and then it comes back to you from all directions." I responded, "It must end up being a complex pattern, because as you're sending your song out, your neighbors are also sending theirs out, and you've got all these overlapping ripples. It's an entangled net so enormous the mind cannot possibly comprehend it. No one knows what's connected to where." I asked how this related to technology. He said, "Technological inventions take from the earth, but give nothing in return. Look at automobiles. They were, in a sense, dreamed over a period of time, with different people adding to each other's dreams, or if you prefer, adding to each other's studies and trials. But all along the way, very little, if anything, was given back to the hungry, invisible divinity that gave people the ability to invent those cars. Now, in a healthy culture, that's where the shaman would come in, because with every invention comes a spiritual debt that must be paid, either ritually or else taken out of us in warfare, grief, or depression. A knife, for instance, is a very minimal, almost primitive tool to people in a modern industrial society. But for the Mayan people, the spiritual debt that must be paid for the creation of such a tool is great. To start with, the person who is going to make the knife has to build a fire hot enough to produce coals. To pay for that, he has got to give a sacrificial gift to the fuel, to the fire. Like what? Ideally, the gift should be something made by hand, which is the one thing humans have that spirits don't. This reminds me of one reason my muse chose me. I have fingers and thumbs and can write things down. He continued, once the fire is hot enough, the knife maker must smelt the iron ore out of the rock. The part that's left over, which gets thrown away in Western culture, is the most holy part in shamanic rituals. What's left over represents the dead, the hollowness that's been carved out of the universe by human ingenuity, and so must be refilled with human ingenuity. A ritual gift equal to the amount that was removed from the other world has to be put back to make up for the wound caused to the divide. Human ingenuity is a wonderful thing, but only so long as it's used to feed the deities that give us the ability to perform such extravagant feats in the first place. So just to get the iron, the shaman has to pay for the ore, the fire, the wind, and so on, not in dollars and cents, but in ritual activity equal to what's been given. Then that iron must be made into steel, and the steel has to be hammered into the shape of a knife, sharpened and tempered, and a handle must be put on it. There is a deity to be fed for each part of the procedure. When the knife is finished, it is called the tooth of the earth. It will cut wood, meat, and plants. But if the necessary sacrifices have been ignored in the name of rationalism, literalism, and human superiority, it will cut humans instead. All of those ritual gifts make the knife enormously expensive and make the process quite involved and time-consuming. The need for ritual makes some things too spiritually expensive to bother with. That's why the Mayans didn't invent space shuttles or shopping malls or backhoes. They live as they do, not because it's a romantic way to live. It's not. It's enormously hard, but because it works. Western culture believes that all material is dead, and so there is no debt incurred when human ingenuity removes something from the other world. Consequently, we end up with shopping malls and space shuttles and other examples of advanced technology, while the spirits who give us the ability to make those things are starving, becoming bony and thin. The universe is in a state of starvation and emotional grief because it has not been given what it needs in the form of ritual food and actual physical gifts. We think we're getting away with something, stealing from the other side, but it all leads to violence. The Greek oracle at Delphi saw this a long time ago and said, "Woe to humans, the invention of steel." I asked why this theft leads to violence. He answered, though capable of feeding all creation, the spirit is not an omnipotent force, as Christianity would have us believe, but a natural force of great subtlety. When its subtlety is trespassed on by the clumsiness of human greed and conceit, then both human and divine nature are violated and made into hungry, devouring things. We become food for this monster our spiritual amnesia has caused. The monster is fed by wars, psychological depression, self-hate, bad trade practices that export misery to other places. We inflict violence upon each other as a way to replace what we steal from nature because we've forgotten this old deal that our ancestors signed so long ago. Instead, we psychologize and objectify that relationship as a personal experience or pathology rather than a spiritual obligation. At that point, our approach to spirituality becomes rationalist armoring, a psychology of protection for the part of us that creates the greed monster, which causes us to kill the world and each other. As individuals, we become depressed because the beings of the other world take it out of our emotions. How so? When we no longer maintain a relationship with the spirits have to eat our psyches. And when the spirits are done eating our psyches, they eat our bodies. And when they're done with that, they move on to the people close to us. When you have a culture that has, for centuries or longer, ignored these relationships, Depression becomes a way of life. We try to fix the depression through technology, but that is never going to work. Nor will it work to plunder other cultures, nor to kill the planet. All that is just an attempt not to be held accountable to the other world. If you're to succeed as a human being, you've got to live meaningfully, passionately, and fully, so that even your death becomes a meaningful sacrifice to the spirits, feeding them. Everybody's death was a meaningful sacrifice until people started to become civilized and began killing everybody else's gods in the name of monotheism. As you grow older, your life becomes more and more meaningful as a sacrifice, because you give more and more gifts to the other world, and the spirits are better fed by your speech and prayers. I asked, how do you respond to someone who says that the notion of paying a debt to the spiritual world for making a knife is just inefficient? In the time your group spends making one knife, my group will make 300 knives and cut all your throats. If you take up that strategy, then you will have to live with the ghosts of all those you've murdered, which means you've got to make more and more knives. And you will become more and more depressed, all the while calling yourself advanced to rationalize your predicament. Even given the fact that it is happening, I still find it hard to believe that anyone could be stupid and insane enough to kill the planet that is their only home. Even given the fact that it is happening, I still find it hard to believe that anyone could succeed in being so destructive. Even given the stupid and insane and sociopathological and hateful rants of scientific philosophers from Francis Bacon to Richard Dawkins to Sam Harris, and the ridiculous polemics of capitalist economists and their pet politicians who buttress their destructive behavior, even given the urging of fellow cult members, whether the cult is monotheism, capitalism, or science, even given the luck we talked about, I still find it hard to believe that anyone can be so insatiably and successfully destructive. We are, after all, talking about the murder of the planet. The question returns, how do they do it? Of course, the fact that they are masters at the application of organized violence and technologies of exploitation certainly helps them perpetuate their destructive behavior. But really, how do they do it? Seriously, to systematically destroy so much, to destroy everyone who lives. Yesterday, I learned that even just 100 years ago, there were runs of salmon 12 miles wide that ran for 28 days. Unless we stop this culture, I give salmon another 15 years before they are driven extinct. So really, how did they do it? Of course, the fact that they have made a fetish, a religion, and an economy of perpetual growth helps to rationalize their behavior. But still, how do they do it? Of course, having the arrogance to believe that you are the only being worthy of consideration and that the world was created just for you to use, in other words, to be a narcissist and a sociopath, helps facilitate these behaviors. But how have they succeeded in killing so many? So much. And of course, having a sociopathic epistemology as described by Richard Dawkins and enacted by the fanatic followers of the cult of the scientific materialist, instrumentalist, mechanistic, managerial perspective certainly also facilitates the destructive activities. But how do they do it? Here's a possibility. What if the Aztecs were right? What if their gods did indeed require blood sacrifices in order to be sustained? And what if every action requires a sacrifice? What if Martin Preshel was right, and we owe spiritual debts to other sides? What if every invention carries with it a spiritual debt that must be paid? What if a knife is an expensive piece of equipment, and a gun even more so, and an airplane even more so? What if an automobile costs more than money? What if it creates a spiritual debt? Let's ask that question about the Aztecs again. What if their gods did indeed require blood sacrifices in order to be sustained? Now let's ask it one more time with two slight changes of emphasis. It might change everything. What if their gods did indeed require blood sacrifices in order to be sustained? And now let's ask a few more questions. What if the other gods require blood sacrifices as well? What if in return for these sacrifices they will give you power? And what if they do not themselves have bodies, do not themselves have hands and fingers and thumbs with which to make things? And what if they need some human followers, some slaves, some addicts, some domesticates, some zombies to do their bidding? And what if these other gods do not wish us well? Do you really think the Aztecs thought their mass sacrifices were anything other than how the world works? Don't you think the Aztecs had an epistemology and cosmology that described the universe in ways that made sense to them, in ways that led them to think that they were just living? What do you call the murder of the oceans? Once, whales were so thick in the oceans, they were a hazard to shipping. Once, fish were so thick you could drop a bucket and remove it filled with fish. Once, seabirds were so thick you could not see the sun. What do you call these murders? What are they if not sacrifices? Most any sane person already recognizes them as sacrifices. The planet is being sacrificed on the altar of economics, or on the altar of technological progress, or on the altar of civilization. But what if this is not merely a figure of speech, but it is in all spiritual truth what is happening? What do you call the murder of the passenger pigeons? Prior to the arrival of this culture, there were more passenger pigeons in North America than all other birds combined. Members of this culture slaughtered them and then slaughtered them and then slaughtered them until there were none left. Prior to the arrival of this culture, there were penguins in the northern hemisphere. They were called great auks, and they were plentiful beyond modern belief. Members of this culture slaughtered them and then slaughtered them and then slaughtered them until there were none left. Prior to the arrival of this culture, the plains and woods were full of bison. This culture slaughtered them and then slaughtered them and then slaughtered them until there were almost none left. What if these are real blood sacrifices? And what if there are gods leading this culture and the sacrifices are absolutely necessary in order for them to be sustained? What if these sacrifices are the source of this culture's luck? Name one indigenous culture which has not been harmed by the dominant culture. You cannot do it because it cannot be done. Every indigenous culture has been harmed. Most have been driven from their land. Most have had their ways of life destroyed. Most have had their languages extinguished. Why? 500,000 children die every year as a result of so-called debt repayment from so-called colonies to the institutions at the center of empire. Are these not sacrifices? Certainly they are sacrifices to capitalism. Who is to say they are not sacrifices to some awful god of capitalism? 60,000 people die every day from the effects of pollution. On whose altar are those lives sacrificed? 1 out of every 4 women in this culture is raped within her lifetime. An additional 1 out of about 5 has to fend off a rape attempt. Whom does this terror serve? Who feeds off this mass terror? To what gods are the unbroken psyches of these women offered? In Songs of the Dead, I described many of the 40-some attempts made to assassinate Hitler. These attacks often failed for nearly unbelievable reasons. Fog saved Hitler's life. Bombs unaccountably failed to explode, even after the detonators fired. A fly landing on someone's hand caused an attempt to be aborted. Soviets could have trapped Hitler deep inside Russia had their tanks not run out of gas directly at the edge of the runway Hitler used to escape. In the famous July 20th, 1944 plot, Stauffenberg was only able to activate 1 detonator instead of the 2 they had planned because someone interrupted him in the bathroom as he was setting the detonators and would not leave him alone. The single detonator may have been sufficient had the briefcase carrying the bomb not been pushed far beneath a massive oak table by someone trying to look more carefully at the maps on top. The list goes on. How did Hitler get so lucky? Maybe the tens of millions of victims of World War II and the Holocaust by a fair amount of luck. I don't believe the Aztecs considered their sacrifices as strange or disgusting. Indeed, they were simply a part of everyday life. The sacrifices were routine. They were simply part of how things were. And how are things now? Here's my final possible reason the dominant culture has been able to dispossess and destroy the indigenous, and why the earth has not killed us off. It is the possibility in which I most believe. This has all come to pass because the dominant culture and its members have been willing to sacrifice so much to their gods. Call these gods God, capitalism, science, technological progress, machines, civilization, or what have you. Or find and call out these gods by names behind these rationalizations. Find and call out these others who do not wish us well. What do you call the murder of canyons, rivers, grasslands, forests, ice caps? What do you call the murder of soils? What do you call the murder of our and everyone else's hormonal patterns as we swim in a cultural sea of endocrine disruptors? What do you call the murder of the planet who is our one and only home? 90% of large fish in the ocean are gone, and governments around the world subsidize commercial fishermen with more money than the value of the entire catch. Governments pay to murder the oceans. How much sense does that make? Children. Human children are undergoing precocious puberty such that little girls are developing breasts as young as 3 years old. And more than 1/4 of African American girls under 8 are growing breasts and or pubic hair. Forget kindness, forget compassion, forget everything but intelligence. Who could beat this stupid? The world who is our only home is collapsing in front of us. Today, February 14th, 2010, was the NBA All-Star Game. More than 100,000 people will attend. It was the largest attendance ever. The world is being killed. And 50 million people watch the Super Bowl for the commercials. And 100,000 people attend a basketball game. With all the world at stake, how could so many people be so stupid? A question I've been asking about abusive behavior since I was a child is, if the abuser's behavior isn't making him happy, why is he doing it? I have explored dozens of answers in my books. But when we are talking about planetary murder and thus species suicide, they all pretty much fail. Who gains by the murder of the planet? And don't say that the rich gain now, and then they don't give a shit what happens in the future. We could stop them in a moment. We could do what every sane culture has done to sociopaths in their midst and kill them. We could cut the throats of anyone who tries to kill the planet. That would be the smart thing to do. We are, after all, talking about life on the planet. But we don't. We watch commercials on the Super Bowl and watch the fucking NBA All-Star Game. I just today learned that several billion people watched parts of the Beijing Olympics. I didn't even know that several billion people had access to televisions, but I do know that several billion people have not entered the fight to save the planet. Why not? By now, you should be able to take a good guess. What if many members of this culture really have become zombies? What if they serve some other master or masters? What if this culture has consistently gotten so fucking lucky, in part because of the sacrifices it makes? And heavy sacrifices they are, to some others, on some other sides, some others who do not wish us well. Whom do you serve? What do you give to those you serve? What are your sacrifices? What are your gifts? Whom or what is sacrificed to those you serve?